Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. Today we've got a Miata modification for you. We're going to show you how to do the front and rear brake pads as well as the front rotors. Now Vince here has his Miata modified for STR and autocross, but he wants to take it to the track, so we're going to do some small brake upgrades. I'm going to show you how it's done right now. Now, in general, the Miata's brakes are fine for autocross and the track, but there is one component that definitely should be upgraded if you're going to do track use where the brakes really heat up, and that is the pads. Rotors, not so much. They're fully capable, and so are the calipers. I mean, you can always spend thousands to upgrade them, but unless you're really a hardcore racer, it's not that necessary. So one of the most important things we're going to upgrade today are the pads, front and rear. He's going to be putting on the Pagid R01 pads that are from the Miata Motorsports website. These are a little more track capable. They're still streetable, but they're a little more track capable. And I know you're out there thinking, I want the best brakes for my car. Well, remember something very important about brake pads. You have a whole spectrum, and on one end you have brakes that don't make noise and they don't dust, but they're only really good on the street. On the other end of the spectrum, there are track pads, and they're not good on the street. They make lots of noise and they dust a lot. There are some that are closer to being reasonable on the street, but still reasonable on the track, and those are still gonna dust and they're still gonna make noise, but they are gonna be usable kind of for both. So those are the best middle ground, and that's kind of where Vince is going today. I have Hawk HPS Plus pads on my car, and that's also sort of the most aggressive pad that you want for street. But I'm sorry, there's no way to get dustless track pads unless you go to a full carbon system, and that's thousands of dollars. He is also going to be upgrading the rotors. Like I said, not that important, but he's going to be doing the two-piece rotors, which save about 8.5 pounds of rotating mass on the front end of the car. Two-piece rotors are just lighter, and you know what? It's always better to have less weight, so he's gonna go ahead and do that, but they are basically the stock size. Now, this isn't the only mod we're doing today. We're also lowering his seat so he can go to track days, and we are, of course, gonna replace the brake fluid in the car. Be sure to check out those other videos on those subjects. All right, let's get to swapping out the front brake pads and rotors and the rear brake pads on Miata MX-5. For this procedure, you will need the following tools. You'll need a 12mm socket, a 14mm socket, a T40 Torx if you are installing the Willwood two-piece rotor hats up front. You'll want a couple of ratchets. A big one and a small one is helpful. You'll need torque wrenches, one that's good for 25 foot-pounds and another for up to 100 foot-pounds, or just at least the 100 foot-pound one, a 17mm spanner, a caliper compression tool, some brake grease, a hook like this to hang your calipers from your spring, a wire brush, some paper towels, and some brake cleaner, of course. And since you'll be raising the vehicle, you'll also need a jack and jack stands and the necessary tools to remove your wheels. Today's install includes Willwood two-piece rotors, Pagid R01 brake pads all around, and we will be changing the brake fluid in another video, replacing it with the RBF 600 by Motul. Remove your wheels with your tool of choice. Vince is using the awesome DeWalt XR electric impact wrench. I absolutely love this thing. I gotta get one soon. And now that we have the wheels off on this side of the car, we have access to the brakes. Here's the rear brake setup, and here's the front brake setup. Now, it doesn't matter if you work on the front or rear first, but I do recommend working on only one side at a time so you can always compare the other to see how things are assembled in case you get lost. Before we get started on pulling those components off, we're going to assemble Vince's two-piece rotors. A lot of rotors that aren't two-piece, you don't have to assemble them so they're ready to go, but in this case, we need to put them together. First, he's just gonna clean off the rotor disc. It comes with oil on it to prevent any rusting. And then we're going to place the rotor hat onto the disc. Notice how it goes on. The flat side of the rotor disc attaches to the rotor hat. We're gonna use these screws that came with the kit and install them all by hand first. Vince is putting a few drops of red Loctite on each screw to ensure that it kind of glues into place, but we can still break it loose later when we need to change the rotor disc. Then you need to torque all the screws down. It may be helpful to have a friend because you'd have to get creative to hold the rotor down without damaging it. Here I help him by holding the rotor in place. He'll tighten a screw down to 25 foot-pounds and then move across the rotor to the opposite side. In the end, he tightens everything down in a star pattern. This ensures a nice, even torquing of the two pieces. So here's the front brake assembly. It consists of the rotor disc, which we will be replacing today on the front of Vincent's car. And then we have the brake caliper bracket. It's attached to the wheel hub on the backside. The brake caliper is attached to the bracket, and the pads are being held in by the caliper. Here's the back side of the assembly, and we're going to first remove the caliper bolts, which hold the caliper to the bracket. These are only on with about 25 foot-pounds of torque, so they're not too hard to break loose. After you get the caliper bolts out, the caliper can come off. It may still be a little tight, so sometimes it helps to pull the caliper towards you to sort of compress the piston that's in there before removing it from the disc. Then the caliper should slide right off, and now you gotta do something with it. Well, I suggest hanging it with a hook piece like this in sort of an S shape. You can hook one end over the spring and hook the other end under the caliper, and now it doesn't have to hang by the brake line, which could be damaging. You don't wanna be hanging the calipers by the brake line, they're heavy. Next, we need to remove the caliper bracket bolts. These were probably torqued on around 70 to 100 foot-pounds, so it's gonna be a little tough. Tapping on the wrench may be helpful, or using a rubber mallet. Once you crack it loose, the rest of the nut can unscrew pretty easily. All right, now for the bottom one. Maybe you can identify what's going on here. It's often easy to get confused which way to turn when the bolt is pointed towards you. And we both made the mistake, and then I realized, yeah.
Always turn it the right direction.
Once we figured that out, we got that bracket off. Now, I've totally made that mistake before, like years ago, but it's always at risk if you're not thinking clearly. Here's the bracket with the brake pad still attached. You can remove the brake pad first or after you remove the bracket. Then just grab the rotor and slide it off the lug studs. Here, Vince is cleaning the hub surface. You really should do this. Clean it with some good brake cleaner, wipe it down, but also use a wire brush to get it as clean as possible because any rust there could start contacting and joining the rotor with the hub. Not only that, but extra particles in that area can lead to brake system vibration. Once it's clean, go ahead and slide your new rotor into place. Next, you can put the bracket back into place and get the bolts hand tightened in. Also be sure to clean up the pad clips as necessary before putting the new pads in. Next, grab your new pads and prepare them with some brake grease. You'll want to apply the grease to the ends of the pads where it goes into the pad clips, as well as a thin layer over the backing of the pad. You wouldn't do this for Brembo style pads, but for these kind, you definitely want to do that and it'll help minimize squeaking. Be careful not to get any grease on the pad's abrasive surface. Now just fit the pads, matching the curve of the pads to the curve of the rotor into the pad clips on the bracket. You may see a brake wear indicator or a metal squealer that would touch the rotor as the brakes wear out. It doesn't really matter if it goes on the front or back. Now Vince is going to torque down the caliper bracket bolts. This totally could have been done without putting the pads in first. It doesn't matter which one gets done first, but we do need to torque the bolts by now. So these are to be torqued down from 80 to about 100 foot-pounds of torque. And you may find, like Vincent is here, it's tough to get 100 foot-pounds on there at this angle. There's not enough room for your large torque wrench, and some of the other suspension components get in the way of the wrench as well. But do your best because you don't want these to loosen up. Now we're going to replace the caliper over the pads. You may want to clean the caliper before doing this. I don't always recommend spraying your brake cleaner on the rubber seals though, but I've never actually seen seals get damaged by it. Before putting the caliper back on, you now have big, thick pads, and the caliper's position after it had worn out the old pads a little bit is going to be too narrow to get back over the new pads. So you need to compress the caliper piston. And you do this by making sure your brake reservoir cap is opened, and then using the C-clamp and a piece of wood or your old brake pad to press the caliper piston back smoothly and evenly back into the caliper. Here's how it should look once it's fully pressed back in. You also want to make sure at the brake reservoir that the fluid hasn't risen up to the top of the reservoir and spilling out, because essentially what you're doing is pushing fluid back into it. Once the caliper piston is compressed, you can put it back onto the brake assembly and put the bolts on. Then you need to tighten down the caliper bolts to the bracket, which are only 25 foot-pounds. You may need to use the 17mm backer wrench to help tighten down the bolts. Congrats, you finished the front brakes on the Miata. Now be sure to do the driver's side as well. All right, let's go to the rear brakes, and you'll see that it's pretty much the same job, but I want to show you a couple differences. The design on the rear brake system is pretty much the same, it's just a little smaller. To get to the pads, you just need to remove the 2 caliper bolts. In this case though, they're only 12mm on the smaller unit. Then, it may be difficult to get the caliper off because you probably have the parking brake set. This car is up on 4 jacks, so we don't need the parking brake set, but if you've got the car on an incline, make sure you chock the wheels. Release the parking brake. Now the caliper should come right off. And then you can hang your caliper like we did before. Now take a look at this caliper piston. See how it's got a cross in it? It's not hollow like the other. That's because of the integrated parking brake. You can't compress this one to get it back in, you have to turn it back in. And although there's tools for that, you can just use a screwdriver like this to slowly turn it clockwise to get it to retract. Some cars have this, but a different shape tool, and there's a whole brake caliper tool set available to rent from AutoZone if you want. As usual, double check to make sure your brake reservoir isn't overfilling as you push the fluid back in. Remove your pads. Go ahead and clean up the area before you install the new pads. Now the new pads should have some metal clips that go on the back of them. We actually forgot to put those on when we filmed this, but we did go back and put them on. Be sure to put those clips on and then add your brake grease. Once the pads are prepped, go ahead and install them and then put the caliper back in place. These caliper bolts also get torqued down to 25 foot-pounds. Of course, you'll need to use the 17mm wrench as a backup to keep the bolt mounting points in place. See, it's just like the front. If you wanted to replace the rotors on the rear, it would be the same process. All right, that's it to swapping out the pads and front rotors. It's not that hard. The Miata actually has the simplest brakes. I think some Miatas have Brembo brakes up front at least, and that's gonna be just a little different. But for this type, the single piston caliper type, that's all there is to it. It's pretty simple and very consistent across other vehicles, so you should be able to change the brakes on most cars by now. The only oddity is the rear brake caliper. The piston, we had to screw it in to compress it. That's not always the case, but it's usually the case if the parking brake is integrated in the caliper. All right, so if you now have the confidence to knock this out yourself, please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified when my next video comes out. Remember, today we're doing 3 mods on this car. We just did that. We're also gonna bleed the brakes and also install seat lowering kit. So be sure to check out those videos. All right, thanks for watching the Jet Fuel Only channel. See you next time.